Uh, okay. Start using good. This is good timing for Laura. Great. And some of you might be manifold curious and just want to see what it is, what it's all about. And this should be able to help you too. So again, chime in as I'm sharing. Interrupt me if I'm screen sharing and not able to see you. So my slides link is there now in the chat, and I'll go ahead and screen share and get started. Okay, so I'm calling this session Publishing OER. Well, it's loading. It's loading. Give it a second. There we go. Publishing OER on a shoestring, Manifold to the rescue. Those of you who are in Iowa have heard me say via multiple avenues that I'm really a big Manifold fan. And so I'm not going to hide that today. Maybe Manifold is my Valentine. I've really found as a one person OER program that Manifold access and the features have really been able to make our OER publishing and adaptation possible. Like we couldn't do it without Manifold. So I'll kind of talk through that a little bit. So what is Manifold? As Marie mentioned, Manifold is a publishing platform. It can be used to publish more than OER, but the Open Education Network access is really designed explicitly for publishing OER. As Marie mentioned also, access at no additional cost is available to institutional members of the Open Education Network. For all of you who are at libraries in Iowa, your institution is automatically a consortial member, and it's a small additional cost to kind of upgrade that membership to the institutional level. So that way you would have the Manifold access, and you can reach out to OEN directly if you have questions about what membership level you're at right now, what it would take to get that institutional membership. But I'll talk a little bit about kind of the cost analysis that we did in a little bit. It's a hosted platform. And so it's being hosted through the Center for Open Education and the Open Education Network at the University of Minnesota. So that means to institutions using the OEN access to Manifold, everything is entirely web-based. There are no servers to deal with. I did not have to beg and plead our IT folks to do different things. And that part was incredibly appealing to my institution as well. Some other things I like about Manifold, it has built-in, very easy to use features for learner engagement or reader engagement. That means things like annotating text, and those annotations can be private, so only that student or that reader would see those annotations, or if they can be shared within a group, or they can be fully public. Highlighting features as well, so you can highlight things as you read. It supports reading groups. I haven't had any instructors use this feature yet, but we could create reading groups such as a section of a course where within that reading group, the students' annotations are visible to each other, but not to other people outside of that reading group who are using the same text that's in Manifold. So that's pretty powerful for that sort of engaging with text. You know, assignments can be built in where we may have students annotate the text and the instructor can see their annotations and they can reply to each other's and so forth. So there's some powerful potential there. But like I said, we haven't used that feature here to my knowledge. Manifold also supports media and supplemental resources, so ancillaries. You know, if an instructor wanted to include a sample syllabus that they use for the course associated with that text, or slides for lecture that goes with that text and so forth. The resources in that section here is highlighted. That's the terminology that Manifold uses for supplemental materials that can come in a variety of formats, PDFs, JPEGs, PowerPoint, and so forth. So they use that resources language where a lot of instructors might call them ancillaries or extras and so forth. I've had quite a few instructors author projects in Manifold, and typically they're not logging into Manifold and working on the back end. I'm doing that for them. Although I had one project team who wanted to do that part, and that was great. I gave them some training on it. But by and large, the instructors who have created or adapted OER with Manifold are just so pleased with it. You can see a quote here from one of our instructors that they talk about it as an aesthetic publishing platform that really kind of bumps up the level of professionalism of the OER that we can create. So, you know, the instructors and faculty being happy with it really helps me because they're likely to initiate more projects, to share with their departments, and share their projects beyond our campus as well. So why the Manifold pilot? So several years ago, as some of you might remember, the Open Education Network offered Manifold on a pilot basis, and my institution signed on to the pilot. And I was really eager for us to do that because prior to that time, we had no OER authoring platform. We don't have Pressbooks here. We don't have a funding stream for the OER initiative or the Open Education Initiative. We have had funding here and there, but it's been either external grants or one-time funding. So there's no annual budget. I don't have a grant program where I can incentivize instructors to do OER projects. However, absent of that funding, there is still interest among faculty in creating and adapting OER. And even in working on projects that might kind of pull together public domain materials. That we've done one project where that was the bulk of the content was public domain materials to replace a commercial anthology text. And that was quite expensive. And so even if folks don't come to me saying, I really want to create OER, sometimes in the course of their project to drive down the cost of materials in their course, that's what we end up doing. And that's in part why I'm doing the back end work, because faculty typically don't have funding. I don't have a carrot or stick. And so I'm really doing the back end work and not expecting that of the faculty. I also wanted to participate in the Manifold pilot because I knew OEN and the open community are really great. And that was another way for me to participate in that. And as Marie mentioned, this pilot was before I was on the OEN steering committee, but since then have joined the steering committee. So I really like any opportunity to connect with all of you and the open education community. So what are some lessons learned from our experience with the Manifold pilot and since then continuing to use Manifold? The institutional OEN membership upgrade from our consortial membership to an institutional membership is worth every penny to me. And reminder, that's a reduced rate for that upgrade for all Iowa institutions. I created some documentation, which is linked here on the slides, to advocate to my dean in the library and others for that additional funding. And I think it was maybe $600 a year. Don't quote me on that. Click on the documentation. But it was my argument for really the cost benefit of upgrading that membership, with the Manifold access being really central to that argument. Through the Manifold pilot, we'd already built workflows and systems and documentation. We were ready to continue with that. And we'd published several projects during that pilot phase. If we lost access to Manifold because we didn't upgrade our membership to OEN, I would have had to take time to transition all those OER projects. I think maybe at the time we had 4 or 5 to some other platform, even maybe Google Docs or something, right? Because we didn't have another open authoring platform. And so I was able to successfully advocate for that additional cost of the membership upgrade. And it's worth every penny, and my dean agreed. The other thing that I think is important here as a program where open education is only about 20% of my job, and I'm the only person on my campus who kind of coordinates and works on the program side of it. And it's really important to take an approach that's sustainable and reasonable. So to me, good enough is good enough, but there are some things where I won't cut corners. So we can't do it all with no funding, but we know that there is interest in faculty adoption and creation and adaptation. So using Manifold has really been pretty streamlined for us because there's so much good support and documentation. I've linked some of the documentation there from OEN, from Manifold itself, and from CUNY, which is one of the Manifold partners, and they're great. So I didn't have to recreate the wheel. I did create some internal documentation, which I've linked there for our authors, just to give them some very basic guidelines and things to keep in mind. So those things are all available and adaptable. I liked that as a, one person shop for not even half of my job, I needed to keep things sustainable and doable. And the existing structures in place help me do that in an effective and efficient way. I mentioned there are some places where I won't cut corners, and accessibility is one of those. There really are some accessibility non-negotiables for me and for our program when we're publishing OER, either original works or adaptations. We're not comprehensive in that necessarily. We don't have the staffing or capacity to be comprehensive, but at the very least, we're ensuring that heading styles are used so that if someone is reading the text that we create in Manifold, that if they use a screen reading software because they have a visual impairment, that they're able to understand the structure of the text with the headings. Things like bold and underlining actually are not helpful in that regard. So the heading styles enable us to do that. And then ensuring that there's alt text, a description for every image. And I've learned a lot about these accessibility pieces. I'm not an expert by any means, but most campuses have an accessibility office that can provide some guidance and support. And I'll mention here that, to me, these are non-negotiables, but also in the not too distant future, there'll be federal non-negotiables. So there are some changes in terms of enforcement of certain parts of ADA that are forthcoming for higher education. We've not heard a ton about it yet on my campus. We have some time, but I'm kind of getting out ahead of that by making sure that we're meeting certain kind of basic levels of accessibility. There is an upcoming OEN webinar on Manifold and accessibility specifically. So I maybe know enough to be dangerous, but that upcoming webinar should be very helpful. And then I've linked there Manifold's key concepts for accessibility. The Manifold folks are very transparent and clear about accessibility, and that is really appealing to us as well. And then I would say the final lesson learned from our kind of working through learning Manifold and using it for projects in our OER program is that the potential is really huge. Both for OER creation and adaptation, but also for open pedagogy. And I hope I'll have a chance to show you an example of kind of our first open pedagogy project that we've been working on here. So I thought I could pause there for any questions first, and then do a little bit of show and tell, and I can do what's most helpful for folks, showing some of our existing projects, and I have some cover shots here of kind of our projects that are finished. And then we have some that are in progress. But I'd love to maybe stop my screen share for a moment and pause for questions right now if there's anything. And you can feel free to use the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting your microphone, that is fine too. What questions can I answer before the show and tell? Or other folks who have used Manifolds, do you want to add any lessons learned? So there's a question in the chat. How do Pressbooks and Manifold compare on accessibility? That's a great question. I don't think I can speak to that. I have not had access to Pressbooks. We did do a couple projects in collaboration with University of Iowa and Iowa State and used Pressbooks, but I was not the primary kind of person working with those projects. So that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I know the Manifold part, and the documentation is linked there in the slides, but I can't speak to the Pressbooks aspects of accessibility. Is there anybody else who could speak to accessibility in Pressbooks?
A little, but I can't compare it to Manifold because I'm just the opposite. Like I don't have experience in Manifold, but Pressbooks does sort of have the typical built-in features for text accessibility. Yeah, and somebody linked to their accessibility chapter in the chat. But like as long as you're using headings and structuring your text, using accessibility tags and things like that that are just built into the text editor, then the book itself should in theory be accessible. But as Anne Marie mentioned, you do have to handle all the alt text and alt tags and captions and things for your images. And that is a challenge to get folks to do that.
And that's one area where the library here has done that work, unless it's a funded project where the faculty member or authors are receiving funding from us, because I feel like if they receive some funding, one of the sort of checklist of things that they're signing on to is you will include these accessibility measures, and we teach them how to do that. But for those projects that we have now, which are completely unfunded, it's a lot for the faculty to be creating the content to begin with. And so I've done, and there's another library staff person who has assisted with the accessibility pieces. I've kind of made that choice because I want to make it as easy as possible for our unfunded projects to actually get accomplished. And I felt like if I asked faculty to do more, like, oh, here's this accessibility checklist you have to meet, I feel like that would stall some of the projects. And I already know the basics, and so it probably is more efficient for me to do that piece of it. So yeah, different institutions do it differently. Any other questions or experiences? Yeah, I was hoping you'd chime in, Jenny. So Jenny from Dordt University said, I want to echo Anne Marie's comments about the helpfulness of the Manifold community. When I had questions, they were answered very promptly, sometimes with HTML code that I could copy and paste into the needed spot. So yeah, the support is really great and responsive. And that comes from both the Manifold documentation, but also the OEN Manifold Google group. That's really useful. And that includes some of the Manifold support folks, but also other Manifold users who may have, done some troubleshooting on a particular issue and have some suggestions to offer. I've definitely made use of those supports as well. And yeah, quick answers, which is great. A few times, one of the Manifold support folks has gone into the back end of one of my projects and fixed a problem for me instead of teaching me how to do it. That's been really nice and kind of unexpected. So yeah, the level of support is good. Thanks, Jenny. Any other questions before I do a little bit of show and tell? That's what everybody wanted today, right? Oh, Christine says, can you clarify what is covered with OEN Manifold? Is it multiple projects, multiple books? Yeah, good question. So the documentation that, let me find the link again, from the very beginning of this webinar, there is the documentation from OEN's Manifold community that would have all the details that you need. I just posted it in the chat again. It's my recollection that it's multiple projects, multiple books. I think I'm working on project number 8 or 9, something like that. So one of the things that I looked at when comparing Pressbooks to Manifold was the limit on the number of projects that some payment levels of Pressbooks have. To get to a level with Pressbooks where we had unlimited projects, which is what I wanted, we were priced out of it. And so we haven't had that problem with Manifold because it's already included in our OEN membership. And it's my recollection that there's not a limit on the number of projects or books that we're working on. Yeah, good question. Double check that unlimited number in the documentation, but that's my recollection. So. Okay, so I'm going to do a little screen share again and do some show and tell here. So these are the covers of kind of our completed Manifold projects. I work with our library PR interns to create the cover art for them. And so our early projects didn't really have any cover art. We've now kind of worked on a workflow process to have students involved in designing the book covers. Occasionally an author will design it themselves or get permission from an artist to use their work or so forth. One of the things that I've done, you can see this cornerstone one here. These are photos from our campus. And one of the things I've done is get sort of blanket permission from our university relations department to use their official campus photos as covers or part of covers in our Manifold OER. They're still under all rights reserved copyright, but they've given us permission to use them, which is great. So we can kind of customize them and brand them with you and I with a pretty campus photo. So you'll see a few of those in some of our different projects on the covers. I thought what I could do is show the Manifold kind of community. This is the overall collection of projects that folks who are participating in the OEN access to Manifold are doing. So I'll put the link directly to this in the chat in case you want to explore it later, but I'll show you what's where. So it gives us a little blurb, that ebook, which is in Manifold, that talks all about the community and the access as under Learn More. There are some featured projects, so a few things that kind of have been highlighted, and some of our projects are here. And then underneath it has these different projects. So this one is a journal that one of the institutions participating is working on. Manifold does have a journal authoring platform or publishing platform. My institution is not using it because we use our institutional repository for that, but it does have that capability as well. Under collections up at the top, we can see the featured projects. We can see the project that Jenny worked on from Dort, which is great. And then each participating institution has their collection, which is great. And some are kind of collective from the network, including a cookbook from OEN members, recipes. Our institution has a U at the start of our name, so it's kind of toward the bottom of the list. So there we are. Here's our full collection right now. So you'll maybe see fewer if you look at this from your, if you're not logged in as a Manifold user. So these are projects that we have available, and we can kind of look through some of them. I thought that would be maybe interesting to you. So I'm going to open up this grant writing one. This is one of our newer publications. This was not a funded project. The instructor just wanted to create this because they saw a need in the OER space related to grant writing. There really hadn't been very many OER related to that. So this landing page for this project gives a little bit of a description. We put the cover art here. I included the links to downloadable chapters. I always try to do that. I do that in a Google Drive folder that's public, but there are different ways to do that. I always want a downloadable option. In order for this text to be listed in the Open Education Network's Open Textbook Library, it must have a downloadable version. So we make a habit of doing that every time. That's also nice for students who maybe don't have internet access all the time. So we include a button that links to that. We've also included a Google form for anyone who has adopted this book or is using it in a course. so that they can report that to us. And then I provide that back to the authors so they can kind of gauge the impact of their project. This particular project has multiple texts. So a text in the sort of language of Manifold is, in this case, it looks like chapters. So any project can have one text or it could have multiple texts. And this one has multiple texts. And I've categorized them. So we have front matter, we have kind of the main content here, and then we have some back matter. And I always put an accessibility statement, which kind of explains, like I did earlier, what the accessibility measures are that we've taken. So this is a book that hasn't been used much lately because it's, or at all, because it's pretty new. This came out right before the holidays in December. So we're excited to kind of publicize it a little bit more. If I click into one of the chapters, you can kind of see the look and feel. So we have the headings, we have the contents available over here. And so there are levels of headings, and that's because we've styled those in the source material. What I do when I'm preparing materials to go into Manifold is to work with them in Google Docs. We're a Google campus. Microsoft Word is an option. There are a few other format options that can be ingested into Manifold. Our authors tend to prefer working in Google Docs because they're used to it and it's user-friendly. There is in Manifold a WYSIWYG editor, so they could author right in that platform if they chose. I like the Google Docs option because our authors are used to it, but also then it's easy for me to make a downloadable version. So that's kind of part of my workflow. So that's kind of what a project looks like on the front end. I thought I could show you a little bit about maybe what a project looks like on the back end. So this is another project that I'm working on. This is an open pedagogy project. It has a working title right now. We haven't decided for sure what the title will be, but leadership case studies. These are authored by students. So this is the first open pedagogy project that we've done. So this has enabled us to kind of set up our workflows for projects that are authored by students. So I don't have a pretty background yet, but that is coming. And then you can see the works that I've already included here. So case studies by students in undergraduate and graduate classes focused on leadership. On the back end of this same ebook, this is what that looks like. So when I'm logged in and I go to edit this book or I go to add more content to it, this is the back end of Manifold. So right now I'm in this texts section. And I'm actually ready to add a new text. So I have about 35 total, and I still have a few left to process from the students who are submitting to it. So in my Google Docs tab over here, you're seeing all my tabs, right? I didn't just share one tab. Give me a thumbs up. Awesome. I always got to remember in Zoom. So this is the Google Doc that the student author shared with me. And I am doing the formatting in here to make sure that accessibility measures are met. And really, that's very simple. So I made sure to highlight the title and call it a title. I made sure to mark the headings as headings. So that's in our little menu up here. So if I highlight that, it says heading 1. That way, Manifold knows that it's going to need to behave as a heading. That will put it in that contents in the public view of this particular essay or case study. If it were only normal text, that would not be the case. I need that heading to be a heading 1. Some of these essays, I do have subheadings also, so I'll use a heading 2 for subheadings. The other thing I've done in here, these are not very long, they're like 2 or 3 pages. There's a list of discussion questions. I've made sure that rather than just the number one, it's actually using the numbered list feature of Google Docs, which is up here. That way Manifold knows that it's going to be a numbered list, so it can display it properly. So you can see my headings there. It's the same things that the document tab in Google Docs is going to show. Some of the authors, the student authors, decided to provide a bio and others didn't. So if they did, I included that here with the author bio heading. And then because each student author selected their own preferred Creative Commons license, and we did some instruction with them about what that means, I included the license down below. This is the only image in this case study. And really for the whole book, those are the only images. There are no other images in this book. So it's been pretty simple to include the alt text. In Google Docs, if I right click and click alt text, this is where that text can go. And I just created a short description. There are lots of guides online for how do you write an effective and succinct alt text for images. So I included alt text for all of the images, which are just the license logos there. And then I'm ready. This one, I didn't have to do too much, and it's not that long a piece. So I have my alt text, I have my headings styled, I have that numbered list. We have sort of a list of things that we want to make sure to do, but I've done those on this document already. So I've ensured that this is shared with the world, and I'm going to grab that public link now because I'm ready to put this in Manifold. So I'm going to copy the link. The link is copied. I'm done with the Google Doc. And I'm going to go back into the back end of my Manifold for this project. These are all the case studies I've already included, but I have this one to add. So I'm going to choose ingest new text. And I can do a couple things here. I can upload a file, and different file formats are supported by Manifold. So you could add a Microsoft Word document and ingest something that way. Because I'm using Google Docs, I can simply paste in that URL that I had just copied when I was on the Google Doc version. So I hit continue, start ingestion, and I wait for it to add the text to the Manifold project. So we'll wait while that continues. And sometimes longer things take a little longer. I've done one text that's hundreds of pages long, and so you just have to be a little patient. This one's not too long. Okay, so here is that same kind of back end of essentially the table of contents. At the very bottom, because I have these categories set up, at the very bottom are any projects or texts where it's uncategorized. I didn't put it in a category yet. So the one I just uploaded is down here. So I can just move it. I can take this. I know it needs to go in chapter 4 because it illustrates the path goal leadership theory. And so I'm going to put it alphabetically by last name within chapter 4. I can also edit some other things about this right here. And I usually do a couple things. So if I go to properties, the only thing I don't like about Manifold is it capitalizes the little articles and the little words, little connecting words. So the, in, I just make those lowercase because I think it looks nicer, but maybe I'm pickier than your average human. I don't know. So I do that much. And then I could add a publication date or different things. I could add an image that goes just with this one text. I'm not needing to do that right now. That's really it. That's the only thing I change is just that capitalization, just because that's a little picky thing for me. And then I hit save text. So it is ready to go. I have the front end, the kind of public side of this book up in Manifold in this other tab. I'm just going to refresh that. And now I can see everything else right here. Let's see if that chapter showed up. There it is. There's the Myers chapter. So I usually look at this front end and just take a quick peek and make sure there aren't any problems. You know, if something is bold that wasn't supposed to be, I'm going to fix it in my Google Doc and then just re-ingest, which is really simple and quick. So that's really it. I make sure that in the Google Doc version, we're meeting those basic accessibility things. You know, I may clean up a few other things, you know, if there was some problem with the references formatting or something like that. But really, I'm not an editor, and we have told our instructors and authors here, we don't provide copy editing. We just don't have the capacity to do that. And so So I'm checking accessibility, I'm checking for any major inconsistencies, but otherwise, and the students in this case have already said they're responsible for the material, so they hold the copyright. So we kind of worked that through before we got the works from the students. So that's really it in terms of including things in Manifold. You know, you can do fancier things. Here's an example where I've included on the public side a background image from our campus and another kind of cover image from our campus. These buttons are all things that we can include, buttons or links. You can choose to include recent activity, like what's changed with this project. Most of our projects, we don't include that in the public view because they're not changing frequently. And then you can have some different options in terms of formatting the sections and categories. I did want to mention resources. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So you can include videos, images, various other things, PowerPoint slides, PDFs that may accompany that text, and those will go in resources. You can link them directly from the text to these resources, which is nice. And I've started playing with that a little bit. You can categorize resources into collections as well. So they're kind of different buckets of resources. If you want resources for chapter 1, resources for chapter 2, you could have your collections set up like that. We haven't done a lot with resources aside from like PDF readings that we have copyright permissions to use that might accompany a text and things like that. I think I'll pause there, and I see there are some questions in the chat. Do you have an example of a book with a lot of images? We'd like to see how we handle it. Yeah, art history would be really interesting. I can show you an example. The one that comes to mind for me is our Media and Power book. So let me pull that up. That nice quote from the author that said, you know, Manifold is this aesthetic publishing platform. That's the main author of this project. So there's the link in the chat so you can kind of go through it. We've also included some images in the resources. Now I will say this book is not done yet, the Media and Power book. We have been teaching from it, but it's sort of being built as a course progresses. And that book is slated to be kind of the central book for a conference, and it's going to be translated into 6 languages. The author team is amazing. So take a look at that one if you want to see how images are included, both in the text itself, but also in the resources. Metadata options. Yeah, so let me show. There is metadata at the project level and metadata at the text level, or like chapter. So I can show you both. Okay, so this is that the back end of that student essay, that case study that I just included, and there's metadata right here. So you can include licensing rights on each one. For these, I may not do that because it's actually on the chapter itself. And then at the book level, if we look at the whole thing, there's a metadata section. And here I have included cases are individually licensed, and then the front and the back matter carry a particular license. There are all kinds of additional things you can put here. Who's the rights holder, any restrictions, who's the publisher. We put our library and university, different versions. You know, we're working on a version 2, you know, edition 2 of one of our texts, and so we'll do some versioning. So yeah, there are some pretty robust metadata options. Yeah, chime in.
Are you able to customize that at all?
In terms of what the fields are here?
Yes.
That would be a question for the Manifold folks. I haven't had that need. I've been able to use the existing kind of fields here, but yeah, the Manifold folks could answer that question.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let me look at the other questions. How did you wrangle the students and authors to teach them about CC licenses for their articles? Yeah, for those case studies. So that's a little bit of a funny story. In brief, the instructor is a big OER supporter, had already created several OER texts. They had students write case studies in 2 classes for this assignment and hadn't considered it as an open pedagogy project from the beginning. That would have been my preference. Rather, they got the assignments when they were done, the students turned them in, and the instructor said, we need to make these available to the world. And so it sort of quickly at the end of last semester turned into an open pedagogy project. So what I did was meet with University Council to make sure that we had an MOU. We were protecting their intellectual property, privacy. We made sure that their assignment grade and course grade was not tied to publishing. They could opt into it. They could include a pseudonym if they chose, or they could be anonymous if they chose. And you'll see in that book, there are some where they've chosen to do that. And some could just opt out completely. They didn't want to publish their work for whatever reason. So I went into that class and basically said, so you wrote a thing, newsflash, you hold the copyright. What can you do with that? If you wanted to share that, what should you think about? We're going to offer you the option to share that. So it was just like a little open pedagogy light. And we talked through the Creative Commons license options. I would be happy to share that slide deck if anybody wants to adapt that. But there are lots of folks who have done many, many more open pedagogy projects than I have. This was literally our first. So yeah, holler if you want that slide deck, but know that there's a lot of open pedagogy stuff from folks who are far more expert about it than me. Jenny said the book that she worked on included a mix of images from Pexels and author contributed photos. So looking at that Foundations of Special Education book that Jenny linked would be a good example for images. Yeah, great. What other questions came up as I did the show and tell, or do you want to look at anything else? Bailey asks, did you publish Manifold projects in your institutional repository as a preservation practice? Yes. Yes. So we have a workflow in place where once the work is completed, we have it in our institutional repository with both a link to the Manifold live ebook version and, if possible, a downloadable option. So that way, when I am counting, trying to determine impact, we can count downloads from that in addition to the Manifold statistics. I didn't explicitly show the Manifold statistics, but they're pretty robust. So that's an option to see with any given date range, how many unique users have used that material, how many people have highlighted, or how many instances of highlighting, how many people have starred it, how many annotations are there. That's fun to track for some of our high enrollment courses that are using Manifold texts. There might be hundreds of highlights and thousands of unique users, which is cool. Rachel says for open pedagogy projects they've worked with, we use our digital commons platform mostly because it allows us to secure our non-exclusive distribution license, and submitters assign the CC license in the submission process. Yeah, so we have something similar to that for theses and dissertations. Open pedagogy, we have decided to go the Manifold route using our IR as sort of the archived version of it. Yeah. Different ways to set it up given your institution and your structure. What other questions do you have?
When you're copying, or like ingesting content from Google Docs, do you ever run into like artifacts of like stray HTML from Google Docs, or does it come over pretty clean?
Generally, it's come over pretty clean. Occasionally, there will be some issues. If it's minor, I will go into the HTML of the Manifold text and then do a little cleanup there. I'm careful about versioning though. And so it's better for me generally to clean it up in the source material in Google Docs and then just re-ingest it, which is a simple, just as quick as that original ingesting that I showed you. So yeah, pretty simple. These are projects that I kind of sneak in my spare time because we're not a funded project or funded program. It's a little unpredictable when faculty will initiate a project. And so that's a little tricky. I wish I could issue a call for projects and, have a bunch at once and train them. And it would be a little more controllable. And then I could put dates on a calendar. Our program just doesn't work like that right now because we don't have funding. And so I really work on them as I can, based on sort of instructor deadlines. If they're saying, I want to teach with this thing starting in the fall, I'll work with them to kind of back up. Okay, that means we need text ready for me to ingest by, say, May, and then I'll have the summer to process content and make sure it's available and, show a mock-up and things like that. So yeah, we're not on hard and fast deadlines usually, with the exception of if an instructor says, this is the first of the semesters where I want to use this thing. But like I said, some of our projects, like a draft version of it as we're building it, is being used for a course. That makes me a little anxious, frankly, but instructors are cool with that. And they tell students, like, we're building this book as the semester progresses, and they work that out, and that's fine. So yeah, I would get anxious if I were that instructor, but it's really up to them. So maybe I'm just more type A, I don't know. I've really enjoyed using Manifold. I am the world's slowest person at learning two things: card games and software programs. And I really want like a checklist, a walkthrough. How do I do it? I'm not like a play around and figure it out, try to break it sort of person. If you are, kudos to you, but that's not me. And it hasn't scared me. At first it did. And then once I tried it, I was like, well, I shouldn't have waited. I should have just dove right in and tried it, because it's really quite simple. I don't use all the features, but again, good enough is good enough for us. And so for our program with minimal staffing and no funding, like it's the best thing, because I can have the Google Docs content, do a little bit of cleanup, upload it, add a pretty cover picture, and we're good, right? So yeah, it really works well for us. Other questions?
Anne Marie, would you recommend that model for people who are maybe heading OER programs at their institutions, of having sort of one person who sort of handles the back end and the ingest and the layout and design, rather than having, a bunch of faculty members kind of learning it on their own?
That's a good question. There are different models at different places. If you talk to the folks in the CUNY system, for example, it's not centralized at all. They have faculty and students even who are creating projects and all of that. With our size of institution, it's manageable. And I really wanted to make sure that, I could minimize the amount of faculty stress by centralizing that sort of publishing piece, and preparing materials, so the faculty members can concentrate on what they're best at, which is the disciplinary content. If they write it in Google Docs or Word, they've done their piece and I can do the rest. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really different at different institutions, but we've chosen to do it that way. I've built the program from the ground up, so I made that choice. And that has worked really well for us, but that doesn't mean it's done that way everywhere.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear kind of some of the different models. I think when we started out with Pressbooks, we sort of went the other way and sort of recommended Pressbooks as the preferred platform, but people could just kind of use what they want, play around with it. And what we found is kind of what you are saying, like a lot of faculty, that's not what they have time for, that's not where they want to put the emphasis, that's not where their skill set is. And so we're kind of in the process of transitioning to more of a library managed model.
Mm-hmm. And I also like the idea of ensuring that we know kind of who's using it and what are they using it for. I don't need to look over their shoulder, but they really need to make sure, all our authors really need to make sure that they're using materials that they have the rights to use, public domain, things that they hold the copyright for, OER that are openly licensed, right? And many of our faculty just don't have expertise in what all those flavors of usage rights are. And the accessibility parts. So if I can have a little bit of control is not the right word, but if I can manage that, we're minimizing risk to the university, because otherwise I would fear, if I just turn over the back end of Manifold to all of these authors, they'd be publishing things they don't have usage rights to publish. I'm working on another project with a faculty member. We're pretty far from putting it in Manifold, but it's all of these images that are part of a lesson plan, a pretty extensive lesson plan. They have hundreds of images with no attributions. Well, I can't just publish that. We don't even know if we have the rights to use them. And so, a project like that, if I turned the back end of Manifold over to that researcher, we'd open ourselves up to a bunch of risk, just copyright reasons, right? So yeah, size of institution we are, we made that judgment call. And I think faculty expertise is not always in, let's learn a new software program, right? Our faculty here are beyond capacity and tapped out. And so anything extra is too much. So the centralized stuff means more for the library, but it has worked really well. I should say I get a little support from our digital scholarship unit. They run our institutional repository. And in terms of helping with longer texts, with checking accessibility and archiving, creating a PDF version, things like that, they help with. So that's been really wonderful. Okay, I'm happy to take any other questions. And I will put my email address in the chat. So if you want to reach out to me, if you need any other documentation, if you want slides for popping into a class and talking about Creative Commons for open pedagogy, what have you, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie. This is really helpful. And I feel like this is definitely something I want to dig into. So if anybody has any questions, like Anne Marie said, go ahead and email her. And thanks for attending today. Have a good weekend.